All right, hi. I'm Paul. I'm a product manager at Google. I've been there about 10 years. I think as Paul Pecci mentioned, prior to that, I actually worked at Just Eat. Paul actually hired me. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the boundaries and the constraints that we create for ourselves, both for the products that we manage, for the teams and the organizations that we create, and they exist for good reasons. So, like a big part of product management is around scoping the problem and defining, the boundaries of what you're trying to solve in order to make things manageable, in order to make them measurable. This applies at an organizational level. I think this particularly applies in big companies. Now, I work for the onboarding team on Android, so we look at onboarding, we look at settings, we look at switching, and what that basically means is we look at how do you go about setting up a new Android phone. And when I joined that team about 5 years ago, we had fairly standard sort of boundaries that we had created for ourselves. So the first time you switch on a phone, you get a screen that says, "Hi, welcome to your shiny new phone." You go through that, you get some connectivity, you log into your Google account, you transfer some data, you consent to a bunch of stuff, and at the end of it, it says, "Congratulations, you've finished setting up your new device, go forth and have fun." And that was the way the team saw itself. That was the kind of boundary that we had created for ourselves. It was essentially a fancy funnel optimization problem at scale across billions of users across the globe. So it's non-trivial, but it's sort of a fairly traditional product management problem. And that team within that context had kind of two things they were worried about. One was an insight that we had derived, which said, if you transfer data successfully when you set up your new device, you're much more likely to buy another Android phone in 2 to 3 years' time. You're much more likely to stay on the platform. And when we looked at UXR and we went and we spoke to real users, about 90% of people said that's the sort of thing they would do. I think a few people like to clean house and start fresh, but most people want to move some data when they buy a phone. But when we looked at what's happening in reality, only about half of people do that. And we never really gotten to grips with why that was. The second problem was looking at iPhone users. Like, we're in the smartphone arena, it's a platform war, it's a competitive thing. And so being able to make sure if you're an iPhone user coming to Android that you have a great initial experience and you get through that really smoothly, that was an important thing for us from a business perspective. It was a tiny percentage of people. And our view was, well, the top of the funnel is very small, that's someone else's problem. Our job is to make sure they get through this as smoothly as possible and hopefully buy another phone in 2 to 3 years' time, and hopefully that's an Android phone. So that was the constraint of the problem. Now, Google, as always, it's another day, it's another reorg, and we love to shift things around on a regular basis because that's what Google does. And we had a new engineering director come into the team, a guy called Ben Breen, who came over from Amazon. And he looked at this problem space, and he believed the team had narrowed its focus too much, and that we had created artificial boundaries that prevented us from realizing the full opportunity that was available. And so Ben was a guy that, prior to this team, I used to work on the phone calling experience. I built things like Call Screen, and I looked at the app that you make calls with. And I think if Ben was on that team, he would have come along and said, we need to build cell towers. Because the biggest problem for phone calling is call quality, and when a call drops, that is the core of the user experience. And if you can't nail the core, you're not doing the job. That would never occur to us as a team, but ultimately build more cell towers. That's the kind of mantra that Ben brought. If we were at Just Eat, for example, he would say, if someone can't pay for their takeaway, we need to find a way to get them money somehow. That's not a Stripe problem. That's not a consumer problem. That's a problem Just Eat should try and solve. That was his kind of mantra. And so he came into the business. He convinced our leadership that we should think more broadly and stop trying to constrain the problem and remove the limits to see what opportunities exist out there in the wild. And so we did that. And so we went out and we started going into retail stores and looking at where people buy phones. And we'd done this before. But rather than watch how people tap through the experience and watch what they do on individual screens, we just stood in the store and watched what people did. And there are a couple of interesting insights. So in the US and India, most people buy phones in retail stores, and most people get the salesperson to help them set it up. That's just how that market works. One of the interesting things is salespeople are motivated by phone sales. It's a commission-based business, and if you have to sit there for 30 minutes or 2 hours, that's time you're not selling other phones. That is literally money that they are losing from their own personal pockets. And so what we saw was that these sales agents they'd get you set up in the most basic way, they'd get you logged into your Google account, but they'd skip the data transfer process. And that was pretty critical for us as a team, because there was a base assumption that of course you would transfer your data when you're setting up the phone. We didn't allow people to do it afterwards. You had to factory reset the device. And so we discovered there was a whole base assumption of our product that we had never understood because we hadn't sat and watched that part of the process in real life. The other thing we noticed when we spoke to them was these guys sell all kinds of phones all day, and they're all slightly different. So iPhones are very similar, Androids, there's lots of different variations. They support slightly different feature sets. They support slightly different types of data transfer. And so they basically said, there's no way we can know all these phones. And so, we just stick to the ones we know, and if we don't know it, we just skip it. So that was really interesting. The other thing that we realized was we went and spoke to people that had never used our product. So we went and spoke to iPhone users who had never used anything other than an iPhone. And we asked them, why have you never tried an Android device? And the number one thing that we realized was anxiety was the universal constant that existed here. People were scared. Like, if you change a brand of phone, maybe even like a Samsung to a Pixel, especially if you change a platform, that's an anxiety-driven experience. Like, you're worried you might lose data. You're worried about having to learn new things. And when they go into a retail store and they ask the salesperson, hey, will all my stuff come across? And you get an answer that's like, probably. All that does is reinforce those anxieties. And then you go talk to friends and family, and very few people have done this, and nobody really understands it. And it just constantly reinforces this anxiety, to the point at which most people just end up buying the same brand of phone, or even worse, they just don't bother, and they put off the upgrade for another year. And these were insights that we only discovered when we spoke to people that didn't use our product, and when we looked at parts of the process we never considered to be part of our responsibility. And so when we distilled that down, we sort of summarized it as peace of mind is actually the problem we're trying to solve. Not just a funnel optimization problem with a CSAT score at the end of it. It was, how do you give consumers peace of mind, make them feel confident, make them feel assured that when they go into processes like this, they will do it, there's a safety net behind them, that the people around them understand how to support this experience well, and hopefully encourage them to buy a phone. And so we pivoted the entire team around that. And that's not a simple thing. Like, peace of mind is not a UI with a button that you press and boom, the user's confident, right? This is a thing that happens across the device experience, across multiple years. It's very hard to measure, but that was the pivot that the team made once we had some of these realizations. There was a bunch of stuff we did. 10 minutes is hardly any time at all, and I'm running behind already, but I want to talk about a couple. So the first thing we did, based on some of that feedback, was we standardized the experience on Android phones. We said, no matter which phone you're buying, it should always allow you to transfer using USB and Wi-Fi. It should always have cloud backup. You should always be able to transfer from an iPhone. And that meant a salesperson in a store didn't really need to know the individual phone. They just needed to know all Android devices do this. Seems like an obvious thing, but actually we hadn't realized that until this point. The second thing, which was extremely non-obvious to us, was we branded the setup experience. Now, it's not an app. Like, fundamentally, it's part of the initial device experience. But because it was hard to describe, people didn't feel confident talking about it. And so we gave it an icon. We called it Android Switch. We put it on the Play Store. We put it on the iOS App Store. And suddenly, when you're talking to a salesperson, they can just say, yeah, you just install the Android Switch app. And it maps to a mental model that consumers had that enabled them to easily talk to friends and family about it as well. So that creating a simpler mental model allowed us to permeate a degree of peace of mind and confidence when you're sort of socializing this with other people. We also discovered when we were talking to iOS people, things like WhatsApp actually prevented people from considering moving. Like, if you're going to lose all your WhatsApp messages when you move from an iPhone to an Android device or vice versa, you're just not going to consider it. And in our world before, that's Meta's problem. Like, WhatsApp has to worry about that. That's not our problem. But actually, it was preventing people from even considering buying one of our phones. And so we worked with them for 2 to 3 years, and we solved that problem. And it made a huge, huge difference to how consumers saw this. And then the other thing we did was we'd always had cloud backups in Android. They're always there. And actually, we'd spend a lot of time making them as transparent as possible. People shouldn't need to worry about data recovery. It's a technical thing. We just want it to be there and it just work. But actually, people didn't know they had it. And so they didn't know they had this safety net that meant if something did go wrong when you upgrade your phone or when you switch to a different phone, they didn't know it was there. So actually we made our solution, we added a little bit of friction, we found touch points across the OS, across various things, just so people knew it was there to help build confidence. There was a lot of other things we did as well, but fundamentally, I think my big takeaway was it's worth understanding these boundaries that we create for ourselves. Like, they're there for good reasons, they're there for organizational reasons, and they do help scope down problems. But they can also limit you to some of the possibilities that exist outside of your day-to-day. And I think coming into a new team, I will now always try and understand why those boundaries exist, try and understand why those roles and responsibilities are the way they are. And I would encourage everyone to question them occasionally, and if you have time, explore outside them occasionally, because at least in our example, there was huge opportunity there, and it was a good learning for me personally. So that's it.